In the name of the Father, and of the Son, and of the Holy Spirit. Amen. Glory to Jesus Christ. If you remember the story in the Old Testament about the Tower of Babel, if you pull out all of the Bible books that you had as a kid, or those picture books, or if it was read to you, the stories, or if you never heard it before. In the Old Testament, we hear about the story of Babel, where man considered himself equal to God, and we will build a tower so that we can come up to God and make our demands of Him, and have Him do our wishes and fulfill our requests. We are full of ourselves and full of pride, and together in one voice they built essentially a ziggurat in Babylon. It's always Babylon for some reason. And of course, the Lord put asunder their efforts. The tower was crumbled, and He confused the tongues, and He divided man, not as a punishment. He divided man into the 70 nations, and He set over each nation an angel, a godlike being, to look after them. He withdrew Himself from man, so that man would not perish eternally. He withdrew Himself for a time because of man's sin. And He divided the tongues. They were not united. Mankind was not united anymore. And we come to the Feast of Pentecost. After the Lord, since the time of the Tower of Babel, after the Lord called Abraham from one of the peoples, out of the desert, He called Abraham. He called His people to Himself. Wandering desert dwellers, He called them. And from every place He would call them, and they would come to understand themselves as the Hebrews, although they did not begin as a homogeneous people. They became such over time. But the Lord taught them how to participate in His glory through circumcision, through keeping the feasts and fasts, through celebrating ultimately the Passover. He taught them how to be His people. And they were distinct from the others. Salvation would come from the Jews, but the salvation of all mankind would come from the Jews. When we reach this Feast of Pentecost, after the Lord Himself has ascended in glory, sitting at the right hand of God with our human flesh, fully God, fully man, sitting enthroned in the kingdom which is here, taking His place. He says, "Go now and tarry in Jerusalem, and I will send my Spirit to give you great power to do, and do you with great power to do things in my name." And so there they were, these unlettered, most of them, Galilean fishermen, who probably couldn't do much more than basic math, because they hadn't been taught, they weren't schooled. They could probably write their name, they could probably do enough reading, perhaps it was Greek, in order to conduct business, to sell the fish that they had caught, or to do whatever their particular calling was. These weren't anything other than average men. They did not all of a sudden, on Pentecost, receive a crash course in how to conjugate verbs in Turkic. They couldn't give a treatise in Greek or in the language of the Gadarenes or anything like that. These were still Galilean fishermen and whatnot. The most average of men. And they, in that upper room, obedient to Christ, tarry in Jerusalem, received the tongues like fire. It didn't say tongues of fire, it says like fire. Tongues above their heads. It was the tongues of truth. It was the coming of the Holy Spirit. And you hear in Acts what was taking place there. It said they began to speak in the languages of other men, which is to say that they began to speak the truth. And everybody marveled that they were speaking in their own languages. These Galilean fishermen, are they drunk? Well, how do they know how to speak my Phrygian? How do they understand how to speak my language? We're here visiting in Jerusalem. We're not even from you people, but how are these guys speaking that I understand them? You see, they did not come down and begin to speak, per se, other languages. They spoke the truth in the Spirit. And the truth is what gathered all of mankind back to God. It was this truth that would gather the people back that had been confused and separated in the Tower of Babel. There is one God over all. And he called the people back to himself in the right time. He sent his son, the king sits on the throne, and the king calls his people from among the nations to himself. Salvation would come through the Jews, but it would come for all mankind. We have this sort of phenomenon happens still to this day. I can give you an example. I will tell you a story. We have heard from some of our Protestant friends who claim to speak in tongues. It's a strange phenomenon of the last several hundred years, largely in America. They call it the charismatic movement, where they will claim to speak in other tongues, and tongues known only to them and God, some other strange thing. And they will call this the gift of tongues, and they say you can read about it in Acts. Missing the entire point. That when we speak the truth in the Spirit, it is understandable no matter who hears it. I once sat, some of you have heard this story, but it's worth hearing again. I once sat at a table at a monastery, a Georgian monastery, and a very sweet little man, who evidently was a giant. He was a bishop, he was an archbishop, who was visiting. And we had had a liturgy, a divine liturgy for some feast. I don't remember what feast it was. And there were, I don't know, maybe 10 people. It was a weekday. There were maybe 10 people present for the divine liturgy. And we had a feast, a small feast in the undercroft of the church afterward. And to say a small feast in Georgian, there is no such thing. If you have to go to a Georgian meal, don't make any other plans for the rest of that day. You're eating all day and drinking wine and what have you, and really digging into the fellowship and really glorifying the feast. So we're sitting there around lunchtime, just chit-chatting, and most people there spoke English, but mostly broken English and some Georgian. And this bishop, Bishop Anthony of Batumi, or Baghdadi in Georgia, not Baghdad in Iraq, but Baghdadi in Georgia. He was a kind-faced, sweet man, but he didn't speak a word of English. I don't even know if he knew hello. I'm quite sure he didn't. He was there, I don't remember what his reason for being in the U.S. was, but he was visiting. And he began to speak. I can't remember what now, I don't remember why, I don't remember what, but I don't remember things very well. But he began to speak. And now my daughter's godfather is before Babel was born, of course, but he leans in and starts to translate what Anthony was saying. And I looked at him and said, I know. He said, no you don't. I said, I know what he's saying. How? I said, I don't know how. But it wasn't surprising either. It was the most normal thing that could ever be taking place. Of course I understand him. And I truly did. Everything that my now brother in Christ was saying, he was saying, it's like I already heard him. I already knew that's what he said. I heard exactly what he was saying. He spoke quietly, sweetly, and with such truth. It didn't matter what language he spoke it in. I understood. That has nothing to do with me. I don't have any special abilities, as you well know. I just understood him. That was Pentecost. That wasn't the feast that we were celebrating, but that was Pentecost. I was experiencing Pentecost. And it wasn't surprising there were no fireworks. It was just Well, duh, of course I understand what he's saying. I was there. And it's happened a time or two again in other situations, where when the Spirit is present and you somehow have managed to get out of his way, and the truth is being spoken, you have the ability to understand. That is what took place at Pentecost. These apostles exited that upper room, having received the Spirit that Christ promised them, having been sent into all the world to proclaim the truth of the gospel of Jesus Christ. And they spoke the truth. Remember how dumb Peter was in the Gospels? He was a dolt. He said dumb things. He didn't think before he spoke. You're always kind of doing face-palming about Peter in the Gospels. This is a very different man that exited that room. Because if you read about anything that Peter's talking about or doing in Acts after Pentecost, this is a changed man. He's casting out demons in the name of Christ. He's confounding sorcerers in the name of Christ. He's raising the dead in the name of Christ. Speaking the truth the entire time. And this is the power of God, not the power of Peter. He's still an unlettered Galilean fisherman. That has not changed. But he has submitted himself to do the Lord's will and to be filled with the Lord's direction. He has managed somehow to step out of the way and allow the Holy Spirit to do his thing. That is Pentecost. You and I are called to having moments of Pentecost. It doesn't necessarily mean that we're going to hear some little man with a funny hat speaking another language and we'll be able to understand. That's not always the miracle of Pentecost. But you and I are called into the miracle of Pentecost. Because what is that miracle? It is laying aside our earthly cares so that the Holy Spirit may do his work. 100% of being in the church and being a faithful person and possessing life eternal is showing up. That is my direction to you. I adjure you today and every day. Show up and get out of the way. That is Pentecost. Show up. Move over. He's got work to do. He's got truth for you to tell. Show up, get out of the way, and let the Holy Spirit act. That is Pentecost. In the name of the Father, the Son, and the Holy Spirit. Glory to Jesus Christ.
Glory to God.